The email arrived at 6:42 on a Tuesday morning. Not from a neighbor, not from an attorney. From a stranger named Kyle Peterson, who'd just put $380,000 down on a vacation cabin he'd never actually be able to reach. His subject line was 4 words. Is your road private? I was standing in my kitchen in Millbrook County, Colorado, holding my phone, looking out at that gravel road. The one my father paved, the one I maintain, the one runs across my deeded property. And I realized in that moment that 47 families had just bought cabins that used my road as their only access route. 47 real estate transactions, millions of dollars, and not one of them had been told the road wasn't public. What Diane Hartwell didn't know, what she'd somehow convinced herself didn't matter, was that I still had the original survey plat, the recorded easement documents, and a land use attorney on speed dial. Stay with me, because what happened next cost her everything. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm a structural engineer. I've spent the better part of 2 decades calculating load tolerances, stress points, and failure thresholds, figuring out exactly how much pressure a structure can take before something gives. Turns out that skill set translates pretty well outside of construction. I bought my 18 acres in Millbrook County, Colorado 11 years ago. Not as an investment, not as a flip. I bought it because I was 34 years old, burned out from city contracts, and I needed somewhere that felt like mine. Somewhere quiet enough that I could hear myself think on a Friday evening. The property had a small workshop, a creek along the eastern edge, a stand of ponderosa pines that smelled like something you can't buy. And it had a gravel road, 1,400 feet of it, running along the southern boundary, cutting through my land, connecting to the county road at one end and to a dead stop at the other. That road was the first thing I asked about when I bought the place. Because I'd learned my lesson the hard way on a previous purchase, a smaller parcel up near Glenwood Springs where a vague easement clause cost me 2 years of headaches and a lawyer bill I don't like thinking about. So this time, I did everything right. I had the property resurveyed. I had the deed language reviewed by a land use attorney before I signed anything. I confirmed, in writing, that the road was on my land, not a public right-of-way, not a shared-use corridor, not an implied easement. Mine. I maintained it that way. Every spring, I'd grade the surface after snowmelt. I replaced 2 drainage culverts on my own dime. I kept the edges cleared so runoff wouldn't erode the shoulders. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was my work, on my land, and I took quiet satisfaction in that. I wasn't a difficult neighbor. Ask anyone in the valley who knew me before all of this started. I waved when people passed. I helped pull a truck out of a ditch one January morning without being asked. I kept to myself, mostly, but I was decent. I believed in being decent. What I didn't account for, what nobody warned me about, was Diane Hartwell. I want to tell you about Millbrook Valley the way it actually was, not the way Diane Hartwell eventually marketed it. It was not a destination. It was not a retreat. It was not a mountain escape community, or whatever phrase her copywriter eventually landed on after billing her 4 figures for the privilege. It was a valley in the middle of Colorado where maybe 60 families lived year-round, most of them for generations. A few of them, like me, who'd come from somewhere else and decided to stay. The county road into the valley was 2 lanes, no shoulder, and the county repaved it roughly once a decade whether it needed it or not. We had one gas station that also sold fishing licenses and breakfast burritos. We had a volunteer fire department that held an annual fundraiser dinner every October, where the same people bought the same raffle tickets, and nobody really expected to win anything. We had neighbors who borrowed tools and returned them without being asked, which sounds like a small thing until you've lived somewhere where that isn't true. That was it. That was the whole thing. And honestly, that was enough. My property sat on the southern end of the valley, backed up against a ridge that cut most of the afternoon wind in winter. The workshop my father helped me build the first summer I owned the place was nothing that would impress anyone. Concrete floor, metal roof, 2 roll-up doors that stuck in cold weather until I shimmed the tracks in year 4. But I'd put in good lighting and a dust collection system that actually worked, and I spent more hours in that building than I probably spent anywhere else in my life. It was where I went when a project at work was grinding me down, when a contract fell through, when I needed to make something with my hands and stop calculating things for a few hours. There's a specific kind of quiet in a workshop when the machines are off and you're just standing there thinking. I've never found it anywhere else. The road ran along the south edge of the property. From the workshop window, I could see maybe 400 feet of it before it curved behind the tree line. In 11 years, I'd watched roughly a dozen vehicles a day use it. My own truck, the occasional neighbor cutting through to avoid the long way around, a delivery driver who'd taken a wrong turn and hadn't figured it out yet. It was a quiet road, an unremarkable road. Gravel surface, 2 tire tracks with grass growing up the middle, a slight crown in the center that I graded every spring so water would run to the edges instead of pooling. I stopped noticing it sometime around year 3. That was a mistake I'd eventually spend considerable time and money correcting. Diane Hartwell arrived in Millbrook County the way certain kinds of trouble arrive. Quietly at first, then everywhere at once before you've had time to get your bearings. She purchased the 90-acre parcel adjacent to the north end of the valley in the spring, 4 years before any of what I'm about to describe came to a head. I didn't encounter her right away. I heard about her the way you hear about most things in a small valley. Someone mentioned it at the gas station. Someone else brought it up at the fire department fundraiser dinner. A developer had bought the old Cranston parcel, a woman from Denver. Real estate background going back decades. Big plans, apparently. I didn't give it much thought. People buy land in mountain counties all the time with big plans that dissolve on contact with a Colorado winter, a difficult septic permit, or the first time they have to deal with a county planning process that runs on its own timeline, regardless of what your investor timeline says. Half the development schemes that get announced in places like Millbrook Valley are dead within 2 years and forgotten within 4. Diane Hartwell was not that kind of person. I should have figured that out sooner. She appeared at a county planning meeting that September. I wasn't there, but 2 people who were gave me accounts of it afterward. She presented a complete development concept. 47 single-family vacation cabins arranged across the 90 acres, a shared amenity center with a fire pit and outdoor seating, a private HOA governing structure, a gated entrance, the entire package positioned as a premium private mountain community. She had architectural renderings. She had a site plan. She had projected annual property tax revenue numbers broken down by phase, which is the specific kind of detail that makes county planning boards lean forward in their chairs. She was polished. She smiled through the entire presentation. The board was impressed. Small counties are generally impressed by someone who walks into a planning meeting with a professional slide deck and projected tax numbers. It's not cynicism. It's just that most of what planning boards see is either routine permit applications or half-formed ideas from people who haven't done the homework. When someone shows up prepared, it reads as competence, and competence gets the benefit of the doubt. What nobody asked that evening, not one board member, not one person in the room, was how exactly 47 vacation cabins on a landlocked 90-acre parcel were going to be accessed from the public road network. Because here is the simple geographic reality of Diane Hartwell's mountain escape community. Her parcel had no direct frontage on the county road. None at all. The county road dead-ended at my property line. The only route into her land that didn't involve a 14-mile detour across a rutted Forest Service road, the kind of road that's impassable in mud season and genuinely dangerous in winter, ran directly across the southern portion of my property, across my road. The one my father helped me build, the one on my deed. She knew this when she bought the parcel. She could not have not known. Any title search conducted by a competent attorney would have shown the road's ownership clearly. She had done her homework on everything else, the renderings, the tax projections, the HOA structure. She had done her homework on this too. She'd simply decided it wasn't a problem she needed to solve before she started selling. She came to see me that October. I remember it was a Tuesday specifically, because I'd taken the whole day off to finish a cabinet I'd been building, a proper dovetail joint cabinet, the kind that takes focus and doesn't tolerate interruptions. And I was genuinely annoyed when I heard tires on gravel and looked out to see the white Land Rover pulling up. She was friendly. Not surface-level, reflexive friendly, but the deeper, more convincing kind. The kind that people who have spent 25 years in real estate develop until it becomes indistinguishable from genuine warmth. She complimented the property, asked about the workshop, what I built in there, how long I'd owned the place. She made easy small talk about the drive up from Denver, about how different the air felt at elevation. She was good at it. I'll give her that without reservation. Then she got to the point. She told me about the development. more detail than the planning board had heard, actually, since she was pitching me rather than a government body, and said she'd need access across my road during construction, and then on an ongoing basis after the cabins were occupied. She was confident this was workable. She was sure we could sort out the details. I told her I was open to discussing a formal easement agreement. I said I'd need to see a written proposal with specific terms: usage hours, vehicle weight limits, maintenance cost allocation, compensation for wear. Standard things. Nothing I was inventing to be difficult. She said absolutely. She'd have something over to me within the month. She shook my hand. She drove away. The Land Rover disappeared around the tree-line bend, and the valley went quiet again. The proposal never came. I waited 6 weeks and sent her an email asking about it. Polite, short, just checking in on the timeline she'd mentioned. She replied 3 days later. Breezy tone, a couple of sentences said things were moving quickly on the project, and she'd circle back to the access question soon. I followed up again a month after that. No response at all that time. And then, the following March, the construction trucks started using my road without any agreement, any easement, any compensation, or any further conversation. Not 1 or 2 trucks, a rotation. Flatbed semis carrying lumber, concrete mixers, excavators on lowboy trailers, pickup trucks loaded with subcontractors who'd park at the entrance and walk in if the road was muddy, and drive straight through if it wasn't. At the peak of early construction, I counted 34 separate vehicle movements in a single day logged in my spreadsheet. Vehicles going in and coming out, tracked by time and type. My gravel surface was getting destroyed. The road wasn't built to handle vehicles of that weight at that frequency. The gravel was rutting. The crown was collapsing in sections. One of the drainage culverts I'd replaced with my own money 2 years earlier got cracked by a concrete truck that drifted too close to the shoulder. I found it on a Saturday morning walk and stood there looking at it for a while before I took the photograph. I put up a no trespassing sign at the road entrance on a Friday afternoon. It was gone before I came out Sunday morning. No note, no call, just gone. I called the county planning office. I explained the ownership situation, the construction traffic, the absence of any easement agreement. The woman I spoke with was polite and genuinely confused. She said the development had received its approvals and that access had been addressed in the application. I asked her to tell me exactly what access documentation was on file, what deed reference, what easement number, what recorded agreement. She said she'd have to look into it. She called back 4 days later. The application had referenced, she told me, existing access routes serving the parcel. That was the complete language. Existing access routes. No deed citation, no easement number, no letter of permission from any adjacent landowner. Just a phrase crafted carefully enough to pass through a review process without triggering a follow-up question from an understaffed planning office that had no particular reason to dig deeper. I want to be clear about what that language actually meant legally, which is nothing. A developer cannot acquire the right to use private land by describing it as an existing access route in a permit application. The legal doctrine closest to acquiring access rights through use is called prescriptive easement, and in Colorado it requires a minimum of 18 continuous years of open, hostile use, hostile meaning without the owner's permission. Diane had owned her parcel for less than a year when construction began. Her HOA had existed for even less time than that. The math is not close. The law doesn't flex to accommodate a developer's schedule just because her application used artful language. What she had, legally, was nothing. Not a thing. I sent her a certified letter that April. I documented everything: the traffic volume, the road surface damage with photographs, the cracked culvert, the missing sign. I stated clearly that no easement had been granted, that no written proposal had ever been received, despite her commitment to provide one, and that continued use of my road without a formal executed agreement would be treated as trespass. I gave her 30 days to respond with a written proposal or remove her vehicles and equipment from my road permanently. She called me 2 days after the certified letter was delivered. Still friendly in tone, but different now. The warmth was still there on the surface, but underneath it something had tightened. Daniel, I think we're overcomplicating a simple situation. This road has been used to access that land for decades. Everyone in the valley uses it. You're going to make yourself very unpopular over a gravel road. I told her I remained open to discussing a formal written easement agreement. She told me I was being unnecessarily difficult. I told her the 30-day clock was running. She hung up. I opened a new spreadsheet that evening and began logging every vehicle that used my road. Date, time, vehicle type, direction of travel. I kept this log every single day for the next 8 months. I have 247 entries in that spreadsheet. I still have it, backed up in 3 places, the way I back up anything I might need to produce in a legal proceeding. That's what being an engineer does to you. You don't stop being angry. You just route the anger somewhere useful. You build a record the way you'd build anything structural, one layer at a time, plumb and level, until the thing can hold real weight. I was building something. Diane Hartwell couldn't see it yet, but she would. Here's something nobody tells you about being in the right. Being in the right doesn't protect you from anything. It doesn't stop the phone calls, doesn't unspray paint your mailbox, doesn't make your neighbors look at you the same way they used to. Being in the right is just a position. What you do with it, that's the part that actually matters. By the time summer hit, Diane's construction was in full swing, and my road had become something I barely recognized. I'd gone from maybe a dozen vehicle movements a day to somewhere between 60 and 80 on busy days. Crews starting before 7 in the morning. Delivery trucks idling at the entrance with engines running while someone figured out where to go. And then there were the sales preview weekends. Diane had started bringing prospective buyers up from Denver in small groups, showing them the lots, walking them through the vision. These people would roll past my workshop in rented SUVs, windows down, looking out at my property the way you look at scenery you're about to own. That last part got under my skin more than the trucks did. The trucks I could document, the damage I could photograph. But watching strangers peer at my land from a developer's courtesy vehicle, that was a different kind of violation, harder to quantify, harder to file in a folder. I installed a gate that July. Steel frame, heavy chain, padlock. Positioned it at the point where my road met the county road, with a sign that said "Private Road, No Trespassing," in letters large enough that nobody could reasonably claim they hadn't seen them. Diane showed up 3 days later. No call ahead, no email, just the white Land Rover rolling up my driveway on a Wednesday afternoon while I was running the lathe in the workshop. I heard the tires on gravel, came out, and found her standing at the gate with her arms crossed and her sunglasses pushed up on her head, staring at the padlock like it had personally wronged her. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "You need to open this gate, Daniel. My crews cannot get through. I have a concrete pour scheduled for Friday, and if it doesn't happen, I'm looking at a $10,000 delay." I said, "Then you should have worked out the easement agreement 8 months ago when I asked you to." She said, "I don't have time for this. Open the gate or I'm calling my attorney." I said, "Get off my property." She stared at me. I think she was genuinely surprised, the particular surprise of someone who has spent decades getting their way through a combination of charm and pressure and hasn't recently encountered a situation where neither one worked. Then she got back in the Land Rover and left without another word. The county received a formal complaint from her the next morning. She claimed my gate was blocking a public throughway and creating a safety hazard for emergency vehicle access. Both claims were false. My road was private, documented as such, and emergency vehicles serving the valley had 2 other access points that didn't involve my land at all. But the complaint triggered an inspection regardless, which meant I spent half a Thursday morning walking a county code officer around my property, explaining the deed situation from scratch. The code officer looked at my deed, looked at the recorded plat, looked at the gate, told me he didn't see a violation. He also had the expression of a man who had been pulled into something well above the pay grade of a routine code inspection and knew it. The complaint went nowhere. But it was only the first move. Within 2 weeks of the gate going in, I received 3 separate notices from county code enforcement on 3 separate issues. The first alleged an unpermitted structure on my property, meaning the workshop, which I had pulled proper permits for in year 2 of ownership and had the complete documentation to prove it. The second alleged improper drainage affecting an adjacent parcel, based on, as far as I or my attorney could determine, absolutely nothing. No measurements, no photographs, no complainant named. Just an allegation sitting in an official envelope. The third was a noise complaint claiming my workshop operations created a nuisance during protected quiet hours, filed by a neighbor I had not had a single problem with in 11 years of living next to each other. I called that neighbor the same day I got the notice. He was embarrassed, genuinely, audibly embarrassed on the phone. He told me someone from the HOA had contacted him and suggested he file a report, framed it as part of a broader effort to document property standard concerns in the valley. He said he hadn't really understood what he was signing off on. He apologized twice. I told him I didn't blame him, and I meant it. He wasn't the problem. He was a tool someone else had picked up and used. That's the playbook. And I want to name it clearly because I think people who haven't experienced it don't understand how effective it is. You don't come at someone directly, not when direct has already failed. You come at them from every angle simultaneously. You file complaints that go nowhere but require responses. You manufacture process. You make the other person spend time, spend money, spend energy on things that have no merit individually, because the goal was never to win any single complaint. The goal is exhaustion. The goal is making the fight feel so endless and so expensive that one morning the other person wakes up and decides it's simply not worth continuing. Diane had run this play before. The smoothness of the execution made that obvious. Then the attorney letter arrived. It came on letterhead from a 4-partner litigation firm in Denver. Real estate specialists. The kind of office that has a receptionist who answers using the full firm name. The letter informed me that Millbrook Ridge HOA had retained counsel and was asserting a prescriptive easement claim over my road, based on, and I want to be precise here, continuous use dating back to the original agricultural development of the Cranston parcel in the 1970s. The 1970s. Diane had owned the parcel for 3 years. Her HOA had existed for 4. But her attorneys had located some record of occasional vehicle access across the southern portion of what was now my land, going back several decades. Farm equipment, in all likelihood, informal and irregular. And they were attempting to thread that history into a modern prescriptive easement argument on her behalf. I want to explain why that argument had almost no legal foundation, because it matters, and it's the kind of thing that sounds intimidating until you actually understand it. Prescriptive easement is a real legal doctrine, but its requirements are strict. In Colorado, you need 18 years of continuous, open, and hostile use. Hostile is the critical word. It means without the landowner's permission. The moment a landowner grants permission, even informally, the clock resets entirely, because permissive use cannot ripen into a prescriptive right, no matter how long it continues. And here is where Diane's own behavior destroyed her argument. She had come to me before construction began, sought permission for access, and I had asked for a written proposal. That conversation, the one she'd walked away from, was documented in my notes, in my follow-up emails, in her own casual phone reply. You cannot ask permission, abandon the conversation when the terms seem inconvenient, and then later claim your use was hostile and unauthorized. The law does not accommodate that kind of selective memory. My attorney laid this out in a 40-minute meeting in his Grand Junction office, and then said something I wrote down because it was precisely right. She's not asserting a legal claim, she's asserting a negotiating position. The goal is to make this feel complicated enough that settling looks easier than fighting. I told him I wasn't interested in settling. He said, good, because the honest assessment is she has very little here. His retainer was not cheap, but by that point I had documented over $14,000 in road surface damage. Gravel rutting, a cracked drainage culvert, eroded shoulders along 2 sections, and I had photographs, repair estimates, and a dated log connecting each item to specific periods of heavy construction traffic. This had stopped being purely about principle somewhere around month 4. There was real, documented, quantifiable damage attached to it now. Diane worked the community angle with a precision I had to reluctantly acknowledge, even then. She had spent 4 years making herself a visible presence in Millbrook County. County Planning Board Advisory Committee, sponsor of the Volunteer Fire Department's Equipment Fund. A table bought at every local charity dinner, visibly, so people saw it being bought. In a valley where 60 families know each other's vehicles by sight, that kind of sustained social investment accumulates into something real. She had built a version of herself in this community, generous, forward-thinking, invested, and she spent the summer drawing on it. The narrative she constructed, carefully, through conversations rather than anything she'd commit to in writing, was that I was the obstacle. An outsider, technically, despite 11 years. A man who had decided that owning a piece of paper gave him the right to hold an entire community's future hostage over a gravel road. That my gate wasn't about property rights, it was about control. About one stubborn man who didn't understand how communities work. She never said any of this to me directly. She didn't have to. I started getting cold looks at the gas station. A couple I had exchanged waves with for years stopped making eye contact. Someone spray-painted "selfish" on my mailbox post in red. Not the mailbox itself, like they'd reconsidered the federal mail tampering implications halfway through the act. I received 3 anonymous voicemails over a 2-week period. 2 were mildly hostile. One was something I'm not going to repeat here. The thing that actually landed hardest, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, was a conversation with my neighbor Pete. He ran cattle in the parcel north of mine. We'd had beers on his porch a dozen times over the years. I'd helped him work cattle through a loading chute one fall morning without being asked. He was the closest thing I had to a real friend in the valley, and he pulled me aside at the fire station one evening with an expression that told me what was coming before he said anything. "Daniel," he said, not unkindly, "people are talking. Is there any way to work something out with her? Just let it move forward?" I told him everything. The October meeting, the certified letter, the unanswered proposal requests, the code complaints, the attorney letter trying to construct a 50-year prescriptive easement out of seasonal farm equipment traffic. He was quiet through all of it. When I finished, he said, "I didn't know any of that. Most people didn't. That was entirely the point." Diane had told one version of this story to the community for months, and I had been too focused on documentation and legal process to tell the other version to anyone. That's a tactical error I won't repeat. You can be completely right and still lose the narrative if you leave it uncontested long enough. Standing in that fire station parking lot while Pete processed what he was hearing, that was the loneliest moment of this entire thing. Not the spray paint, not the voicemails. That specific moment, when I understood how completely she had rearranged the social reality around me while I was busy building my legal case. It was the first time in my adult life I felt like the villain in my own story. And I think if you've been through something like this, if you've been on the wrong end of someone who is skilled at working a room, you know exactly what that feeling is. It sits differently than other kinds of unfair. It's disorienting in a specific way. I drove home that night and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and pulled up the spreadsheet. 247 rows, vehicle logs, damage photographs organized by date, copies of every letter sent and received, the deed, the survey, 2 attorney opinions. I went through it slowly. Then I sent my attorney one line. Find out exactly what she recorded with the county recorder's office regarding access to that development. Every document, all of it. He called me 4 days later. His voice carried the particular quality of someone who has found something considerably worse than they were expecting to find. "Daniel," he said, "she didn't just use your road, she recorded it." I asked him to say that again. "She filed HOA governing documents with the county recorder listing your road as," I'm reading directly, "HOA maintained common access infrastructure serving Millbrook Ridge community. She used it as a disclosed feature. She sold it to 47 buyers as part of what they were purchasing." I sat with that for a long moment. She hadn't just trespassed. She had taken my road, dressed it in legal-sounding language, and sold it to 47 families as something that belonged to them. And every one of those families had handed over hundreds of thousands of dollars without knowing the road in their purchase documents was sitting on someone else's private property without that person's permission. My attorney said something quietly after a pause. "She didn't just trespass on your land, she sold the trespass." That was the moment the shape of everything changed. This was no longer a dispute about a gate. It never really had been. I just hadn't seen the full picture yet. What it actually was 47 fraudulent real estate transactions built on an access right that Diane Hartwell had never owned and never had any legal basis to promise anyone. And somewhere out there, 47 families were about to figure that out. Kyle Peterson's email arrived at 6:42 on a Tuesday morning. I mentioned that at the very beginning of this story. What I didn't tell you is what I did after I read it. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and read it 3 times. Then I opened a document and started typing a response. Deleted it. Started again. Deleted that one too. Because the question I kept running into was, what do you actually say to a man who has just spent $380,000 on a property he cannot reach? A man who did nothing wrong, followed every normal step a buyer follows, hired an agent, reviewed disclosure documents, closed properly, when you're the person holding the padlock. I ended up writing 4 sentences. I told him the road was private land. I told him I had not authorized its use as community access. I told him I was sorry he was in this situation, and I told him he should speak with a real estate attorney before doing anything else. He replied within 20 minutes. And he wasn't angry at me. That was the first thing that caught me off guard. He was angry at the disclosure packet sitting on his desk, the one that listed the road as HOA maintained common access infrastructure, with no mention anywhere of private ownership, no asterisk, no caveat, nothing. He said he'd read it 3 times looking for the qualifier. There wasn't one. He asked if he could call me. We talked for an hour and 15 minutes. By the end of the conversation, I had agreed to speak with anyone else in a similar situation who reached out, and he had agreed to start connecting with the other buyers. Neither of us said it in those terms exactly. It developed more naturally than that. 2 people who'd been wronged by the same party realizing they were looking at the same problem from opposite ends, and that they were more useful to each other than apart. Within 8 days, I had 23 emails sitting in my inbox from cabin owners across the development. I want to be specific about that number because each one represented a real family. Someone's retirement plan, someone's idea of a life they'd been building toward, expressed in square footage and mountain views, and the particular kind of hope people have when they buy a place they plan to love. Diane had counted on them being too geographically scattered, too individually small, too overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation to coordinate any meaningful response. That was the second significant miscalculation she made. The first was assuming I wouldn't push back. The buyer who fundamentally changed the trajectory of everything was a woman named Sarah Okonkwo. She'd purchased one of the larger cabins, $487,000, largely cash, and before she retired, she had spent 22 years as a prosecutor in the Denver District Attorney's Office. She reached out to me directly after Kyle shared my contact information with the group, introduced herself in 2 sentences, and then said 5 words that I still think about occasionally. She left a paper trail. Sarah had already pulled Diane's disclosure packages, the HOA governing documents, the county recorder filings, and the original permit application before she contacted me. All public record. All accessible to anyone with the patience and the knowledge to look. She had organized everything into a chronological timeline, annotated, cross-referenced, the kind of document that doesn't argue or editorialize. It just shows. A prosecutor's timeline. What that timeline demonstrated, without any ambiguity, was that Diane had known about the private road ownership issue from the very beginning of the project. The permit application's reference to existing access routes, that deliberately imprecise language, had been filed at a point in time after she had already approached me seeking a formal easement, and I had requested a written proposal in response. She knew, at the moment she filed that application, that she did not have permission to use my road. She filed anyway. She built anyway. She sold anyway. That is not a disclosure oversight. It is not a paperwork gap or an administrative error or a misunderstanding between parties. It is a decision, a deliberate, calculated decision to proceed with the development and complete 47 real estate transactions while concealing a material fact about access from every single buyer. Sarah said it plainly on a group call with about 15 of the buyers one evening. She didn't make a mistake. She made a decision. There's a legal difference between those 2 things, and it matters enormously for what comes next. I was on that call. I mostly listened and took notes. The buyers group filed a formal complaint with the Colorado Division of Real Estate that October. 31 of the 47 owners signed on to it. The complaint document ran to 64 pages including exhibits, Sarah's timeline, the disclosure packages, the recorder filings, the permit application with its vague access language, my deed, my survey, photographs of the gate and the road surface, and the full correspondence record between me and Diane going back to the original certified letter I'd sent nearly 2 years earlier. Simultaneously, my attorney filed the quiet title action in district court, a legal proceeding that, when successful, permanently establishes ownership on the public record and formally eliminates any competing claims. The specific goal was to have Diane's HOA recorder filing voided and my ownership documented in a way that left zero interpretive room for any future challenge. 2 buyers filed separate civil suits against Diane and the HOA for fraudulent misrepresentation in the first week of November. A third suit followed 2 weeks after that. Diane's response to all of this arriving at once was to hire the four-partner Denver litigation firm and go on offense. Or what looked like offense, but was, on closer examination, a holding action. Her attorneys filed a motion challenging my quiet title action, reasserted the prescriptive easement argument, and added an adverse possession theory that required even more years of documented continuous use than prescriptive easement, and was, if anything, a weaker position. They also sent letters to several of the complaining buyers, suggesting their complaints rested on a misunderstanding of Colorado access law, and implying, without quite stating outright, that pursuing litigation might negatively affect their property values. That last move, contacting buyers who were already her victims and attempting to discourage them from pursuing legitimate legal remedies, became its own exhibit when Sarah included those letters in a supplemental filing to the Division of Real Estate the following month. My attorney reviewed Diane's legal filings and gave me his honest assessment. They're throwing arguments at the wall. None of these positions have real traction given your documentation. She's paying her attorneys to buy time and hope something changes. Nothing changed. The documentation held. The story became public in November through a journalist named Marcus Webb, who covered real estate development for a Denver business publication. He'd been tracking the short-term rental construction boom in Colorado's mountain counties and had a source, not a leak, just someone in the planning office who mentioned there was an interesting access dispute connected to the Millbrook Ridge development. Marcus called me. I gave him my attorney's contact information and let the public record speak for itself, which is always the right move when the public record is saying what yours is. Marcus spent 3 weeks on the piece. He interviewed 8 cabin buyers. He reviewed the disclosure documents and the recorder filings. He drove out to Millbrook County and photographed the gate, the road, the development sitting behind it. He was thorough in a way that good journalists are thorough. Not looking to land on a conclusion first and find evidence second, but actually following the documents where they went. And then he called Diane for comment. She agreed to a sit-down interview. I still don't fully understand that decision. Maybe she believed she could reframe the narrative the way she'd reframed it for the Valley community, through warmth and confidence and the sheer force of a well-delivered story. Maybe she underestimated how thoroughly Marcus had already read the documents before he sat down across from her. Maybe she simply couldn't resist the opportunity to talk, which is a particular vulnerability that people who are very good at talking sometimes have. The piece ran on a Thursday. The headline was straightforward: Vacation cabin buyers seeking refunds after access road dispute. But the structure of the article was what made it effective. Marcus had laid the timeline out cleanly, in chronological order, letting each document speak in sequence. Diane's interview quote appeared near the end, after the reader had already absorbed everything the documents showed. She had said, in essence, that the access situation had always been intended to be formalized, and that she was working toward resolution. Which sounds reasonable. Until you've just read a timeline showing she'd had 4 years, multiple written requests, and a certified letter with a formal 30-day response deadline, and had chosen not to formalize anything at any point. The piece was picked up by a real estate trade publication 2 days after it ran. A Denver television station ran a brief segment the following week. It wasn't national news, too specific, too geographically contained for that kind of reach. But in the world of Colorado mountain real estate, which operates through a surprisingly dense network of brokers, developers, investors, and buyers who all know each other or know someone who does, the story traveled fast and landed hard. Diane's financial position came apart in a way that, professionally speaking, I recognized. It was a structural failure, stress concentrating at exactly the points where the load was highest and the support was weakest, until the whole thing gave at once. The HOA carried real operating costs: road maintenance contracts for its internal roads, utility service for common area lighting, landscaping, an insurance policy, a property management software subscription, a part-time bookkeeper. These costs were funded by monthly dues from the 47 cabin owners. When the story became public and the Division of Real Estate complaint was on record, 22 owners stopped paying dues. They had the right to do so. The HOA's own bylaws contained a dispute resolution provision allowing dues suspension during active legal proceedings affecting common infrastructure. Diane had written those bylaws. She hadn't anticipated being on this end of them. She had personally guaranteed 3 of the HOA's vendor contracts, not unusual for a developer-controlled HOA in its early years, when vendors require personal backing because the HOA itself doesn't carry sufficient financial reserves. What becomes unusual is when those guarantees all come due simultaneously, because the HOA's income has been cut nearly in half by a situation the developer created herself. The landscaping company put her on formal notice in December. The road maintenance contractor suspended service in January. The bookkeeper stopped showing up when her checks started bouncing. The 4 board members Diane had appointed, all of them carrying professional relationships or financial ties to her development, began resigning in late November. The first left with no public statement. The second cited personal reasons. The third and fourth resigned within the same week, and by that point no one was treating the timing as coincidental. Under the governing documents Diane had filed, the same ones that had listed my road as common infrastructure, a board falling below minimum membership triggered a mandatory membership vote to reconstitute. With 22 owners withholding dues, the remaining owners deeply uncertain about the HOA's legal standing, and 3 active legal proceedings attached to the entity's name, that reconstitution vote never produced a functioning result. The HOA entered functional dissolution. Diane was left in the middle of the wreckage she'd built. No board, no dues income, personal guarantees coming due on vendor contracts, a state investigation open, 3 civil suits filed, a quiet title action her attorneys were burning through retainer fighting with arguments that weren't working. A published story indexed permanently to her name. And 47 families who had trusted her with their money now coordinating with attorneys of their own. My attorney called me on a Friday afternoon. I was in the workshop, to tell me the last 2 board resignations had been filed that morning. I turned off the lathe, sat down on the shop stool, let it settle for a minute. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to say that clearly, the same way I was clear about the parking lot conversation with Pete. What I felt was closer to the particular exhaustion that comes after you've been holding tension for a very long time, and the thing you were bracing against finally stops pushing. Not joy, just the absence of the weight. I locked up the workshop, went inside, made dinner, just pasta. I ate it standing at the kitchen counter, looking out the window at the road, dark, empty, completely quiet. It had been a long time since it was quiet like that. The quiet title action resolved first. District Court, March. 8 months after my attorney filed it. Diane's legal team had thrown 3 different arguments at it: prescriptive easement, adverse possession, implied easement by necessity, and the court dismissed all 3. The judge's written ruling was 14 pages. I've read it probably 6 times, not because I needed to, but because there's something grounding about seeing the facts of your own situation laid out in clean, unsentimental legal language by someone with no stake in the outcome either way. The ruling voided Diane's HOA recorder filing, the one listing my road as common access infrastructure, and permanently established my ownership on record. Not just confirmed it, established it in a way that created a legal precedent specific to this parcel, this road, this deed. Any future claim against it would have to climb over that ruling to even get started. My attorney called me when the decision came through. He read me the operative paragraph over the phone. When he finished, I said, "Okay." He laughed a little, said most clients react with more enthusiasm. I told him I'd been confident in the outcome for a while. What I felt wasn't surprise, just relief that the process was finally done producing paperwork. The Colorado Division of Real Estate completed its investigation 5 months after the complaint was filed. Diane's broker license, she had operated as the listing broker on 11 of the 47 transactions, was suspended pending a formal disciplinary hearing. The division's findings cited failure to disclose a material fact affecting access, specifically the private ownership of the primary access route. In real estate law, access is about as material as it gets. You can argue about a lot of disclosures. You cannot reasonably argue that buyers didn't need to know their road wasn't public. The disciplinary hearing was scheduled, then rescheduled twice. I didn't attend. I wasn't a party to that proceeding. I was a witness whose documentation had been submitted as evidence, but my presence wasn't required. My attorney kept me updated. The outcome, when it came, was a 2-year suspension and a fine that felt modest given the scale of what had happened. But license suspensions in real estate are not modest consequences. They are career consequences. Diane had spent 25 years building a professional identity in Colorado real estate. That identity now had a public disciplinary record attached to it that would follow every license renewal, every broker association application, every background check a future business partner might run. The civil litigation took longest, the way civil litigation always does. 31 of the 47 buyers had joined the class action by the time it was formally certified. The defendants were Diane personally, the HOA entity, technically still a legal entity even in its dissolved state, and two title insurance companies whose pre-closing title searches had failed to flag the private road ownership issue as a material concern. I was not a plaintiff. My damages were separate: the road surface repairs, the cracked culvert, the attorney fees, the year of my life, and those were addressed in a separate claim that settled before the class action concluded. I won't give you a specific number because it was subject to a confidentiality provision, but I'll tell you it covered everything I'd spent and then some, and I considered it fair. The class action settled in the spring of the following year. Total settlement, $4.1 million. Funded in thirds, roughly, a portion from Diane personally, a portion from whatever remained of the HOA's assets and insurance, and a significant portion from the title insurance carriers, who had their own exposure and their own reasons to resolve quickly rather than litigate. Each buyer's individual recovery varied based on purchase price and documented damages, but the range ran from $40,000 to just over $120,000 per household. Sarah Okonkwo called me the day the settlement was announced. She didn't say much, just that it was done, and that she thought I should know before she heard it elsewhere. I thanked her. She said, "Thank yourself. Your documentation made this possible." Then she said she was going to go figure out the alternative access situation, because she actually liked her cabin and intended to keep it. That made me laugh. Genuinely. First real laugh I'd had in connection with any of this in probably 8 months. The access road situation resolved in a way I hadn't entirely predicted. I had assumed, going in, that I'd either negotiate a formal, limited easement on my terms or simply not grant one at all. What actually happened was more complicated and, in the end, more interesting. A land trust organization that had been monitoring the valley for conservation purposes approached me about a permanent conservation easement on the southern portion of my property, an arrangement that would restrict development, protect the drainage corridor along the creek, and come with a tax benefit. As part of that broader negotiation, a narrow vehicular access easement was structured for the cabin owners through a different route, across a corner of the land trust's adjacent holdings that didn't touch my road at all. It took 4 months of negotiation and a surveyor I'd worked with before. But when it was done, my road was mine again, completely. No shared use, no maintenance obligations to anyone else, no strangers' tires on my gravel. I repainted the gate on a Saturday in October, just touched up the rust spots and put a fresh coat of black on the frame. Took maybe 40 minutes. The dog sat in the driveway watching me like I was doing something deeply suspicious, which is his default position on home improvement activities. Pete came by a few weeks after everything settled, brought a 6-pack, which is the Millbrook Valley equivalent of a formal apology. We sat on the porch and he asked me to walk him through the whole thing, the real version, start to finish. I did. He listened without interrupting, which is not his natural inclination. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have asked more questions before I listened to her." I told him she was good at what she did. That wasn't an excuse, it was just true. Diane Hartwell had spent decades learning how to construct a narrative and deliver it to an audience that wanted to believe it. That's a real skill. It just happened to be deployed in service of something that was fundamentally dishonest. A few of the cabin owners I'd spoken to through this process became, in a loose way, neighbors. The kind you wave to, occasionally exchange a text with, run into at the gas station, and have an actual conversation with rather than a polite nod. Kyle Peterson, whose email started all of this, finished out his first full season at the cabin that fall. He sent me a photo once, just the view from his porch, the ridge in the background, aspens already turning. No message, just the photo. I understood what he meant. The county planning office revised its access documentation requirements the following year. Not dramatically, not a sweeping policy overhaul, just a quiet procedural change requiring that any permit application referencing existing access routes include recorded deed or easement documentation proving legal right of use. A small thing. The kind of change that doesn't make news but prevents the next version of this from happening to someone who doesn't have an engineer's instinct for documentation. I still go out to the workshop most weekends. The road is quiet. 2 tire tracks through the gravel, grass growing up the middle, exactly what it looked like before any of this started. The drainage culvert I replaced is holding up fine. The gate sits at the entrance, unlocked during the day, locked at night, the way it always was before I needed it to mean something. I'm not someone who draws big lessons from things. I'm an engineer. I tend to think in terms of what failed, why it failed, and what you changed to prevent the failure from recurring. In that framework, what failed here was a system that allowed a developer to file permit applications using deliberately vague language without anyone in the review process asking the obvious follow-up question. That's a process failure. It got fixed, modestly, locally. Good enough. What I'll tell you, if you're watching this because something similar is happening to you right now, is this. The documentation is not optional. The certified letters are not optional. The attorney consultation you've been putting off because you don't want to spend the money, that's not optional either. Property rights are only as real as your willingness to defend them, and you cannot defend what you haven't recorded. Keep records. Know your deed. And when someone tells you not to worry about the paperwork, worry about the paperwork. Diane built a $14 million development on a foundation she didn't own. All I did was remind her of that, repeatedly, in writing, with documentation attached. If you've dealt with an HOA or a developer who decided your property rights were negotiable, drop it in the comments. I read them. And if this story hit close to home, you know what to do. Subscribe, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and I'll see you in the next one.